Welcome to Interview from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlsen, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on teleSUR. The latest figures show 102,000 intentional murders, 70,000 extrajudicial executions, some 26,000 people disappeared. The human rights situation in Mexico is serious. How did the human rights situation in Mexico deteriorate so rapidly, and what can be done about it? To answer these questions and many more, we're very privileged to be here with Mario Patron, director of the Miguel Agustin Pro Center for Human Rights, based here in Mexico City, but that works throughout the country. Mario, thanks so much for being with us today on Interview from Mexico.
Al contrario, muchas gracias a ustedes por invitarme.
Mario, many people, including your own center, have said that Mexico is facing a human rights crisis. Do you agree, and why is that?
Mira, nosotros decimos que México enfrenta la peor crisis de vigencia de derechos humanos.
Look, we say that Mexico is facing the worst crisis in human rights in at least the past 2 decades. And we talk about 4 factors that for us configure the crisis. One is the context of the country's macro-criminality. Cases like Ayotzinapa show us that there are regions in our Mexico where the state institutions are weakened and it is organized crime that has regional and territorial control. The political authorities work not to fulfill their legal mandates or for the interests of society, but to carry out the business of organized crime.
El crimen organizado se ha apoderado en algunas regiones del país de las economías ilegales vinculadas con el tráfico.
Organized crime has taken over in some regions of the country, like the illegal economies linked to drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and human trafficking, etc. But also they have taken over formal economies. Ayotzinapa is a clear example of this, a situation where we have 6 persons executed, 43 persons disappeared. The seedbed, the basic platform for this was the political corruption in the context of the macro-criminality. We have municipal authorities working for the benefit of organized crime, and we have a context in which the state and federal authorities knew what was happening territorially in Iguala and in Cocula, in all these municipalities in the state of Guerrero, but that border on the states of Mexico and with Michoacán. This is not exclusive to the state of Guerrero. There are states like Tamaulipas, Michoacán, and other places where the institutionality of the state is at the service of organized crime. The second factor we see that contributes to this crisis is corruption, seen in all of its aspects. We talk about 2 kinds of corruption, political corruption and economic corruption. According to studies by the World Bank itself, for example, it establishes that in 2013, 9% of the gross national product, which represents in turn 80% of all taxes collected, is corruption in our country. There are 2 types of economic corruption that are extortion and collusion. The common factor is impunity. The corruption linked to economic power is not investigated, and neither is the political corruption linked to political power. We're talking about political parties. When we look at Ayotzinapa, it shows us the corruption of political parties that put up candidates that are members of organized crime. For example, we're talking about the different parts of the government that are linked, municipal, state, and federal powers.
So just to define some of those terms for our audience, you mentioned corruption in the form of extortion and in the form of collusion. Could you explain that a little bit?
La extorsiva, como dice su nombre, es cuando el funcionario que forma parte del poder político.
Extortion, as the term implies, is when the official who forms part of a political power uses his or her post and power to extort the citizenry as a whole, and it is linked to goods and services, but with things that are very much tied to the daily life of citizens, like getting a license, a permit, all these relations that link citizens to political power. And the collusion has to do with political and business sectors, and it is collusion with political power and with economic power, and it is tied to bids, permits, public works, to everything that has to do with spending public funds and could have to do with public works contracts, right? And for that reason, there's collusion. In these 2 variables, let's say, that are political corruption, is exactly where we find what the World Bank says represents 80% of taxes collected, and that's a lot. And the other is precisely political corruption. It has to do with more with the exercise of power and how political power puts itself at the service of illicit powers like organized crime.
And that's where it can get dangerous.
Undoubtedly, it's there where it gets dangerous, and Ayotzinapa is clear proof of that. The third element, or the third factor that we consider makes up this moment of crisis, is the existence of grave human rights violations. We have forced disappearances, torture, and extrajudicial executions.
So we're talking about crimes against humanity.
We're talking about violations that indicate crimes against humanity. And we're talking about crimes being carried out by government authorities in collusion with organized crime. We're talking about grave violations, and we're also talking about humanitarian international law, right? So what the reports have said, both from the United Nations and from the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, is that torture, disappearance, and international homicide are applied in a generalized manner in the country. In the case of torture, the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on the issue of torture said that it is applied in a generalized manner from the detention to the indictment of prisoners. Torture continues to be a primary mechanism of investigation in this country and of criminalization of persons who are guilty and also people who are innocent.
So they're talking about something that's structurally part of the way the country operates, not isolated cases here.
Eso ha incomodado mucho a nuestro gobierno federal, al Estado mexicano, la palabra generalized.
This has made our federal government very uncomfortable, the word generalized. And it is a word that in reality is not new. In a previous visit in 2014 report of extrajudicial executions by the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, it says that from 2006 to 2013, there were at least 102,000 intentional homicides in our country. Of these 102,000 intentional homicides, only between 1% and 2% were brought to justice. That is to say, we have a structural problem of impunity. And in the case of forced disappearance, we have to say that according to the Committee Against Forced Disappearance of the United Nations, they've said that in our country, in 26 of 31 states of the Republic, we have a context of disappearances. So this means that this crime is also applied in a generalized manner. So we have macro-criminality, corruption, grave violations, and last but not least, impunity. We can't forget that recently the High Commissioner of the United Nations visited Mexico and said that Mexico is in a wave of structural impunity because 98% of the cases and the crimes in general in our country aren't investigated, aren't judged, and aren't punished.
So we're talking about generalized, structural, and serious violations of human rights. That's a crisis. We're going to take a short pause. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking to Mario Patron, director of the Miguel Agustin Pro Center for Human Rights here in Mexico. Mario, I want to turn to some of the most important cases that we're seeing right now here in Mexico. And one of them, without a doubt, is Ayotzinapa that you mentioned earlier. Why does your center see this case as so significant, and what kind of strategy are you applying to search for the truth and for justice in this important case?
Ayotzinapa condensa toda esta realidad de la que hemos hablado, todos estos factores de macrocriminalidad, impunidad.
Ayotzinapa condenses all of this reality that we have been talking about, all of these factors of macrocriminality, impunity, corruption, and grave violations of human rights. Ayotzinapa is a thermometer of our reality in this country. We have a country that is injured. Unfortunately, the 43 that are missing are not the only disappeared people in our country. The High Commissioner of the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission, as well as report at least 26,000 disappeared. So we say that this is a structural problem. Ayotzinapa has had certain characteristics that have made it possible to link various sectors of the country to support it, and even international solidarity. Another systematic strategy in our country is that it has constantly been said that violence is exclusive to organized crime, not the state, and that the disappearances are a consequence of conflicts between small groups of organized crime. The government wasn't able to say this about the Ayotzinapa case because they were students from the rural teacher college who were going to collect funds, who were going to take buses to go to a demonstration.
de días posteriores.
And the police, an element of the state, were directly involved.
Y queda muy clara la participación del Estado en la colusión del crimen organizado.
And the participation of the state is very clear, in collusion with organized crime. We've had other tragedies of similar magnitude in this country, like the massacre of San Fernando, where 72 bodies were found in a common grave. The difference is that we are talking about migrant persons in transit that are in a condition of extreme vulnerability in our country. In the Ayotzinapa case, we are talking about a group of 43 families that have been able to join forces with the student movement of the rural normal school of Isidro Burgos of Ayotzinapa. And for this, the pressure has been maintained even a year later. So there is a base of protest made up of direct and indirect victims of the case that has allowed the case to remain in the spotlight.
And it really struck a nerve within society at large as well.
Justo por estos factores que se conjugan es que Ayotzinapa ha podido construir esta solidaridad.
And because of that, Ayotzinapa has been able to consolidate this national and international solidarity. It was after the tragedy, there was an opportunity for the Mexican state to investigate, to uncover these circuits of political corruption, to uncover the whereabouts of the students, to assure truth, justice, and reparation. Ayotzinapa could have been a point of no return, a point of inflection. And what we have instead are the same circuits of structural deficiencies in the investigation, the same circuits of impunity, and even the same circuits of cover-ups. By not locating the 43 students, it revealed the incapacity of the Mexican state to search for disappeared persons. In this context, the parents requested technical assistance. The federal government accepted the technical assistance, and so we worked to create the interdisciplinary group of independent experts under the auspices of the Inter-American Commission. The group of experts investigation is unprecedented in Mexico. They arrived on March 2nd in our country. They worked to the first 6 months, and they presented a report that was devastating for Mexico.
560 pages of facts.
Es una investigación única en la historia de nuestro país.
It's an unprecedented investigation in the history of our country. From November 2014 and later in February of 2015, the former Attorney General Jesus Mario Patron had made public the federal government's theory of the case, which was that the students had been incinerated in a dump and that their bodies were practically reduced to ashes. There was no way to find technical scientific evidence on the identification of the students. This group of international experts arrived from the Inter-American Commission. They carried out an in-depth investigation and they announced to the public, quote, "The investigation is poorly done. There are gaps. There is evidence that was tampered with and other evidence that was not included, testimonies that were not taken, crime scenes that were not investigated by the public ministry." They also told us that not only the municipal police were involved, but that there was a process of following, of monitoring the students from the time they were in Chilpancingo and they went at 6 in the afternoon to Iguala. And the report revealed that the federal police, the state investigative police, and the Mexican army itself participated.
So at the very least, they knew it was happening and did nothing to prevent it.
Exactamente, por lo menos sabían qué estaba pasando.
Exactly. At least they knew what was happening. They even watched direct attacks on the rural college students and they did not intervene. For that reason, it has to be investigated to find out if it was due to an issue of complicity or if it was an action orchestrated by different police, different forces of different levels of government. But also what the group of experts tells us is that the Attorney General's theory of the case is not scientifically viable. There are 5 people arrested who are those who, in theory, confessed that they took the young rural college students to the dump of Cocula. They executed them and they incinerated them.
These are members of the organized crime group, Guerreros Unidos.
Sus declaraciones, ellos se autoscriben como integrantes.
In their declarations, they describe themselves as members of Guerreros Unidos. But these are declarations that very probably were taken with methods of torture and generated elements of self-recrimination. Today, what the expert group tells us is that what these 5 persons said is scientifically impossible. That at this dump at Cocula, there couldn't have been a bonfire big enough to incinerate 43 bodies because the scientific evidence shows that you'd have to build a fire of such irradiation that it would practically generate a forest fire. If the facts had happened the way these 5 persons say, they themselves would have been burned alive. for example. And so what the group of experts says is that the theory that the former Attorney General gave out and that the current Attorney General gave out cannot be sustained.
So that pretty much destroys the government version. Are we back at zero?
Yes, undoubtedly what was a historic truth, as the federal government announced, has been converted into a historic lie. And of course, for the fathers and mothers of the victims who are searching for their sons, the report of the expert groups gives them hope because it proves that the government lied. But it's also a huge disappointment because it's the sensation of having to go back to day one, when they began to search for their sons 1 year ago, which has gone by without conditions for a successful end to the search of where the students are.
So it's tremendously exhausting and painful for them.
It's tremendously exhausting and painful, and that's why it's very important the commitment that the federal government should assume, not just in its speeches but in practice, to comply with the results of the report of the experts. The investigation cannot be laid to rest as is. Now, in the Attorney General's office, there's a bias to support its theory of the case. Today, in the Attorney General's office, all the actions they carry out are to confirm their theory of the case and not to open up new lines of investigation. That's why the investigation has to be taken out of the hands of the current team. A specialized unit investigation specifically and concretely for the case of Ayotzinapa has to be created, and the integration of the team of investigation has to be supported by the experts group.
So the Mexican government has a huge challenge to advance in this case.
Without a doubt, today the mothers and fathers of the students ask themselves, why go back to believing in the government institutions that lied to us? And the only way is to create a specialized investigative unit in which the whole team is new and is endorsed by the experts group. And furthermore, the plan of the investigation has been developed along with the group of experts. Only in this way will we really have an investigation with international supervision, which is the only way to assure the mothers and fathers that they won't lie to them again.
We're going to another short break. I want to come back to another important case, which is Tlatlaya. We'll be right back after a moment. We're back talking to Mario Patron, and before the break we mentioned the case of Tlatlaya. What's the importance of this case? We just saw that 4 of the soldiers who had been indicted in the case were released. 3 more are still facing charges, and this has become a major example of extrajudicial executions. How have you been working on this case?
Tlatlaya representa, además de Ayotzinapa, yo considero que la segunda mayor violación de derechos humanos en nuestro México contemporáneo. Estamos hablando de una masacre, es un operativo militar que encuentra presumiblemente a una célula del crimen organizado. Hay un primer enfrentamiento.
Tlatlaya represents, in addition to Ayotzinapa, I consider the second major violation in contemporary Mexico. We're talking about a massacre. It's a military operation that presumably encounters a cell of organized crime. There is a first skirmish between the army and this group of persons. Once this group gives up, the confrontation ends, and when they are already in the custody of elements of the army proceeds to execute them extrajudicially and arbitrarily. We're talking about persons that were already under state control, in this case by the army. And so instead of arresting them and delivering them to the custody of the competent authorities that should investigate and judge them and sentence them, they went ahead and took justice into their own hands by proceeding to execute them extrajudicially. We have a resolution of the National Commission on Human Rights, Recommendation 51 of 2014, that says that at least 12 to 15 persons were executed, and before that the Federal Attorney General's Office had arrested 7 military members for the execution of 8 people. There's a numerical difference, but at least there are 2 institutions of the state that accept that there were extrajudicial executions. This is a recent resolution in which they freed 4 soldiers due to deficiencies in the case put together by the Federal Attorney General's Office, for failure to notify them of the charges against them so they could prepare their defense accordingly for the 4 soldiers that were freed. And there are 3 military members who are still being tried for qualified homicide. The relevant aspect of the case is that in the context of the investigation as a Human Rights Center, we represent one of the surviving victims of the case. In this context, we discovered the general order for the operation, which is an official document that the superior officers emit to their inferiors in the army, and they give out the instructions for the operation. Our surprise was that the seventh order of the operation establishes and gives the order for the military forces to go out on and do nocturnal rounds and under cover of darkness take down delinquents. For us, this is a very serious order, and it's clear proof that for the Army we are in a state of exception and in a context of war that is not formalized, not declared. And it's in this situation that they send out these forces, their forces, to take out delinquents or criminals. It's an order that cannot be defended in a democratic state of rights, but also is not even justified in the rights of war. In the second facultative protocol of the Geneva Conventions, it establishes that in internal armed conflicts, the order cannot be to, quote, eliminate. You have to apply proportional use of force, and there is a right to prioritize the civilian population in these cases. For this reason, it is a totally illegal order. We have requested that they investigate the line of command, the institutional responsibility, precisely to establish the measures of no repetition so that these incidents are not repeated. It's important to say that they have already been repeated because just in the month of June of this year, another similar case happened, which is Calera, Zacatecas. Here, 7 day laborers were disappeared by members of the Army and executed. Their bodies showed up later in the surrounding fields. So what they say is that the absence of justice and of sanctions in cases like Tlatlaya and the investigation, the lack of investigation of institutional responsibilities allows these incidents to be repeated.
And there's the effect of impunity.
There's an effect of impunity, which is a factor of permissibility for these incidents to continue to be repeated.
So these systems basically, they pressure the Mexican government. They provide, as you say, an overview of what's really happening in the country. And they also demonstrate to the rest of the world what's going on. That visibility has a certain value as well, I imagine.
Sin duda alguna, México tenía instrumentado una narrativa muy fuerte frente a la comunidad internacional como un Estado.
Without a doubt, in the international sphere, Mexico had deployed a very firm narrative as a state that guarantees the exercise of the human rights of its citizens and of those who transit within its borders. So we have these last 2 reports that confirm an evaluation of crisis, but they also confirm that we have to build an agenda for change, an agenda for legal frameworks, public policies, and government programs. The problem is political will. The response of our government to the report that the Inter-American Commission emitted was to disqualify it and not accept the evaluation. When the government doesn't accept the evaluation, what that means is that it is not willing to implement the measures of change to modify the reality. And this is really a tragedy in terms of the country because what we need is to join together as government and civil society, build common agendas, and what we need is for all the different powers to take responsibility, the legislature establishing legal frameworks, the executive branch implementing public policies, and the judicial power establishing criteria of access to justice.
So as citizens, we're up against a situation where we have a grave violation of human rights. We have a government that's reluctant to respond to the gravity of that situation. What can we do in this context of impunity and violations?
It is the moment for a strong civil society. It's the moment for a society and democracy that organizes, that raises its voice, that stands in solidarity with what hundreds of victims experience in our country. But also the moment for us to demand the minimum in truth and justice and reparations. If in this Mexico today as civil society we don't organize to ensure that these tragedies like Tlatlaya and Ayotzinapa really are brought to justice, in reality we are all, men and women, running the risk that possibly we become the victims in the future.
Well, Mario Patron, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back next week on Interview from Mexico.